Welcome to Books and More Audio, the place where we explore books that challenge how we see the world. Today, we dive into The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, a bold and eye-opening work that exposes how governments and corporations exploit crises to impose policies and profit from chaos. This book uncovers the hidden truth behind wars, financial collapses, and natural disasters, revealing how human suffering has been turned into a business model. Join us as we discover why the shock is not just an event, but a global strategy of control and manipulation. Introduction: The Beauty of Blankness. 3 decades of erasing and rebuilding the world. The introduction of the shock doctrine begins with a chilling observation. In times of disaster, whether natural, economic, or political, there are always those who see opportunity in chaos. Naomi Klein reveals how governments and corporations have repeatedly used moments of collective shock to push through radical free market reforms that would never be accepted under normal circumstances. She draws a powerful parallel between psychological shock therapy and economic shock treatment. Just as patients in post-war psychiatric experiments were stripped of memory and identity through electroshock and sensory deprivation to be rebuilt, entire societies have been subjected to similar treatment. Wars, coups, financial crashes, and natural disasters serve as instruments to erase old systems, leaving nations disoriented and vulnerable. In that confusion, new economic orders built around privatization, deregulation, and corporate control are imposed. Klein opens with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where the tragedy of the poor became a business opportunity for developers and private schools. She then traces this pattern back through history, from Pinochet's Chile to post-Soviet Russia, from the 1997 Asian crisis to the invasion of Iraq, each case showing how destruction clears the ground for reconstruction, but reconstruction always favors the elite. Her central claim is that neoliberalism thrives on crisis. The shock itself, whether physical or psychological, is the means by which resistance is broken. Once people are too traumatized to fight back, the new order arrives wrapped in the language of progress and freedom. The introduction ends as both a warning and a call to awareness. Klein urges readers to recognize that what appears as disaster relief or reform is often a calculated strategy of domination. The beauty of blankness is a lie. Behind every erasure stands exploitation, and behind every reconstruction stands profit. Her message is clear. Until we understand how shock is weaponized, we will remain its victims, believing that recovery is freedom, when in truth it is submission. Part 1. The Two Doctors of Shock: Research and Development. Part 1 of the shock doctrine unfolds like a dark mirror reflecting two parallel revolutions, one in the field of psychology, the other in economics. Naomi Klein brings us into two laboratories, separated by discipline but united by philosophy. Dr. Ewan Cameron's psychiatric experiments, funded by the CIA, and Milton Friedman's economic doctrines, nurtured at the University of Chicago. Both men, in their respective ways, believed in the same core idea. To remake the human mind or a society, one must first destroy it. In Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, Dr. Cameron pursued what he called psychic driving. Convinced he could erase mental illness by wiping the mind clean, he subjected patients to extreme electroshock therapy, drug-induced comas, and endless loops of recorded messages. His goal was to reduce the human brain to a blank slate, a mind free from past associations, ready for new programming. Instead, his experiments left patients shattered, memoryless, speechless, stripped of identity. Klein presents these victims as the first casualties of a terrifying new philosophy, that destruction can be a form of creation. Meanwhile, across the border, Milton Friedman and his students at the University of Chicago were developing their own form of shock therapy, not for individuals, but for entire nations. Their economic doctrine, later known as neoliberalism, preached that true freedom could only exist when the market was pure, untouched by government, labor unions, or social welfare. But to reach that purity, the existing social order had to be dismantled, sometimes gently through policy, often violently through crisis. Klein draws a haunting parallel. Cameron's electric shocks and Friedman's economic shocks were two sides of the same coin. In both cases, the method was to induce chaos, erase resistance, and rebuild according to a rigid model. Cameron destroyed minds. Friedman destroyed mixed economies. Both believed that suffering was a necessary step toward rebirth. This section also traces how these ideas escaped the laboratory and entered the world. The CIA took Cameron's findings and built interrogation manuals like the Kubark, Counterintelligence Interrogation Guide, used to train torturers across Latin America and Asia. At the same time, Friedman's disciples, later known as the Chicago Boys, carried his economic gospel abroad, transforming Chile under Pinochet into the first testing ground for neoliberalism. The parallels are chilling. Both projects relied on shock, fear, and submission to reprogram the human mind or the national economy. Naomi Klein's narrative voice in this section is calm yet searing. She shows how science and ideology merged into a single logic of control. The belief that pain can cleanse, that chaos can renew, that the broken can be rebuilt better. But behind that belief lay something far darker, a willingness to treat people as raw material for an experiment. Part 1 closes with an image both literal and symbolic. A woman, once a vibrant patient, now sitting silently after Cameron's treatments, her memory erased. Klein calls her a metaphor for our time. Humanity stripped of memory, left open to manipulation, told that forgetting is healing. And thus, she warns, the groundwork for the age of shock had been laid, a world ready to be wiped clean and rewritten over and over again in the name of progress. Part 2. The First Test, The Birth Pains of the Shock Doctrine. Part 2 of the Shock Doctrine marks the first real-world application of Milton Friedman's theories, the transformation of an abstract economic idea into a brutal political reality. Naomi Klein calls this period the birth pains of the New Order, when shock therapy moved from classrooms and think tanks to the streets, prisons, and markets of Latin America. The story begins in Chile, 1973, where the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende was overthrown in a violent coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, with support from the CIA and the U.S. government. While the world's attention focused on tanks and executions, a quieter revolution was unfolding behind the scenes. Friedman's disciples, the so-called Chicago Boys, arrived to implement a radical experiment, the complete liberalization of Chile's economy. In a few months, the junta slashed public spending, removed price controls, privatized state industries, and opened the country to foreign investors. These measures, hailed by Friedman as the miracle of Chile, were in truth an economic shock treatment inflicted upon a traumatized nation. Inflation soared, unemployment skyrocketed, and poverty deepened, yet the elites and multinational corporations flourished. Klein draws a devastating conclusion. The free market could only be free after freedom itself had been crushed. She reveals a grim choreography between political terror and economic reform. The coup's physical violence, imprisonment, torture, and disappearances was not a tragic byproduct, but a precondition. It paralyzed the population, erased resistance, and prepared society for economic restructuring. In Klein's words, the political shock cleared the ground. The economic shock rebuilt it in someone else's image. The Chilean experiment soon spread to Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, each under its own military dictatorship. Everywhere, the same pattern emerged: mass arrests followed by mass privatizations. Governments silenced dissent while dismantling social protections, selling public assets to global corporations at fire sale prices. The torture chambers of the South became the engine rooms of neoliberal reform. Klein calls it the real laboratory of free market capitalism. She then connects this pattern to a deeper psychological truth. The logic of torture and the logic of market reform are one and the same. Both seek to break the subject. Torture destroys an individual's identity to make them obedient. Economic shock dismantles a society's collective memory so it can be reshaped. In both cases, the result is submission disguised as renewal. By the 1980s, the success of these experiments made Chile and its neighbors models for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which began exporting shock therapy worldwide. What began with electric shocks in a hospital had evolved into a global policy, an ideology that profits from crisis and calls destruction opportunity. Part 2 closes on a haunting reflection. The free market system was born not in prosperity, but in blood and fear. Nations that were promised freedom ended up enslaved to debt and inequality. For Naomi Klein, the birth of the globalized market was less a triumph than a caesarean of violence performed on nations too weak to resist. In her piercing prose, Klein declares that the first test of the shock doctrine was not an economic success, but a moral failure, one that revealed the true nature of the system, a faith that justifies cruelty in the name of efficiency, and a capitalism that grows only by tearing down what came before. Part 3. Surviving Democracy. When bombs were replaced by laws. Part 3 of the Shock Doctrine chronicles how the tactics of economic shock evolved once the world entered the age of democracy. After decades of coups and dictatorships, overt repression became less acceptable, yet the same agenda continued, this time wrapped in the language of freedom, reform, and modernization. Naomi Klein calls this the era when the bombs were replaced by laws. The story begins in Britain under Margaret Thatcher and the United States under Ronald Reagan, two leaders who turned neoliberalism into a political creed. Both claimed to rescue their nations from stagnation, but their true mission was to dismantle the social contract built after World War II. Using democratic mandates as shields, they unleashed a new form of shock therapy, legal, bureaucratic, and psychological rather than physical. In Britain, Thatcher confronted a restless working class and powerful trade unions. When the Falklands War erupted in 1982, the patriotic fervor that followed became the emotional shock she needed. Riding the wave of victory, she declared war on the unions, privatized public industries, cut welfare, and sold state housing. Klein calls this a soft shock, one that didn't use violence but left similar scars: mass unemployment, broken communities, and a deep social divide. The military had been replaced by police, but the purpose remained the same: to crush collective resistance and usher in the supremacy of the market. Across the Atlantic, Reagan carried out a similar revolution. He slashed taxes for the wealthy, deregulated industries, and weakened labor protections, all under the promise of freedom. In reality, this was freedom for capital, not for people. The welfare state that once balanced capitalism's excesses was replaced by a new moral code. Wealth equaled virtue, poverty equaled failure. Klein argues that both leaders perfected a new model of governance: shock by consent. Instead of imposing change by force, they manufactured crises, inflation, debt, moral panic, and used them to justify drastic measures. As the 1990s arrived, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank globalized this model. Under the guise of structural adjustment, developing nations were told that loans would only come with radical reforms: privatization, deregulation, and austerity. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, entire economies were rewritten by foreign technocrats. Hospitals closed, food prices soared, and millions fell into poverty. Yet Western investors celebrated liberalization. Klein exposes this as shock therapy on a planetary scale. What made this phase so insidious was its democratic disguise. People voted, but markets ruled. Governments were elected, but real power belonged to investors and rating agencies. As Klein writes, democracy was hollowed out from within, its rituals preserved, its substance sold. The will of the people could be overwritten overnight by the will of capital. And unlike military coups, this form of control needed no tanks, only spreadsheets, contracts, and fear of economic collapse. Klein portrays the 1980s and 1990s as a turning point. Neoliberalism no longer needed dictators. It had learned to operate through financial coercion and cultural consent. The world believed it had escaped authoritarianism, but instead it entered a subtler, more enduring tyranny, the tyranny of the market. Part 3 ends with a chilling observation. When bombs are replaced by laws, the war does not end. It simply becomes invisible. Naomi Klein reminds us that what appeared as a triumph of democracy was in fact its capture. From now on, every economic crisis would serve as a new kind of coup, a silent one, executed not by generals but by economists. Her message is clear. In the age of global markets, shock no longer destroys democracy from the outside, it corrodes it from within. Part 4. Lost in Transition. When we cried, when we trembled, when they danced. Part 4 of the Shock Doctrine takes us into the chaotic twilight of the 20th century, the period when the Soviet Union collapsed, apartheid fell, and a new global order promised freedom but delivered exploitation. Naomi Klein calls this the era of being lost in transition, when nations emerging from dictatorship or socialism were promised democracy and prosperity, yet instead faced the most ruthless form of economic shock therapy ever devised. The story begins in Eastern Europe after 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and capitalism was declared victorious. In Poland, Klein describes how euphoria quickly turned into despair. The people, newly freed from communism, were told that freedom required pain, shock therapy, to cleanse decades of state control. Guided by Western economists like Jeffrey Sachs, the government froze wages, lifted price controls, and privatized industries overnight. Within months, prices skyrocketed, unemployment soared, and social safety nets vanished. The result, Klein writes, was a second shock. After the political one came the economic one, leaving the people disoriented and vulnerable. The same pattern unfolded in South Africa after apartheid. The victory of Nelson Mandela was celebrated worldwide as a triumph of justice, yet behind the scenes, economic freedom was quietly traded away. While Mandela fought to build a democratic constitution, Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank pressured his party to sign binding economic agreements that protected the old elite's wealth. When the African National Congress finally took power, it discovered that political liberation had come with economic chains, debts, trade deals, and privatization clauses that limited its ability to deliver justice to the poor. As Klein puts it, the people of South Africa won the vote but lost control of the economy. Then came Russia, the most extreme experiment of all. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, U.S.-backed reformers imposed shock therapy at lightning speed, price liberalization, currency devaluation, and mass privatization. Entire industries were sold to a handful of insiders, the oligarchs, who became billionaires overnight, while millions lost their savings and livelihoods. Inflation exceeded 2,000%, life expectancy fell, and ordinary Russians were plunged into poverty. Klein calls this Pinochet's ghost in Moscow. The same ideology that once ravaged Latin America now returned in a new form, justified as modernization. Asia soon followed. The 1997 financial crisis struck like a tsunami, devastating economies from Thailand to Indonesia. Under IMF rescue packages, countries were forced to sell national assets, cut social programs, and open markets to foreign investors. Once again, crisis became opportunity for corporations, not citizens. Klein writes bitterly, "Each disaster was a doorway through which the same policies marched. Across continents, the logic remained constant: shock, disorientation, and capture. Those at the top called it reform, but for the majority, it was economic colonization, a transfer of wealth and power from the many to the few." Klein describes how amid the rubble of collapsed economies, a new global elite emerged, those who danced while others cried. They were the bankers, consultants, and investors who profited from privatization, buying public assets for pennies on the dollar. "When we cried, when we trembled, they danced," she writes, a single line that captures the cynicism of an era. Part 4 closes with a sobering insight. Transition was never about development, it was about redistribution, upward. Freedom was used as bait to justify the dismantling of solidarity. The nations promised a brighter future found themselves trapped in a global hierarchy of debt, dependency, and despair. Naomi Klein concludes that the so-called transitions of the 1990s were not the birth of freedom, but the replication of empire, now enforced through markets instead of armies. The shock doctrine, she warns, had perfected its technique. It no longer needed violence to conquer, only hope, confusion, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Part 5. The Era of Shock. The Rise of the Disaster Capitalism Complex. Part 5 of the Shock Doctrine marks the point where Naomi Klein reveals the full maturity of disaster capitalism, no longer a temporary tactic, but a self-sustaining system. In this new era, wars, crises, and catastrophes are not exceptional moments to be managed. They are profitable opportunities to be manufactured, maintained, and monetized. Klein calls this structure the disaster capitalism complex, an alliance of governments, corporations, and private contractors that thrive on permanent instability. The turning point came after September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks plunged the United States and the world into shock, paralyzing critical thinking and heightening fear. But as Klein notes, while citizens grieved, corporations mobilized. Within days, billions of dollars in contracts were signed with private defense, surveillance, and security firms. Fear became the new fuel of capitalism. In this war on terror, security replaced consumption as the engine of economic growth. Companies like Halliburton, Blackwater, Lockheed Martin, and Booz Allen Hamilton expanded from military suppliers into global service providers, managing prisons, schools, borders, and even disaster zones. War, reconstruction, and policing merged into one continuous industry. Klein calls it the privatization of the state itself. Governments outsourced not just labor, but their most essential functions, intelligence, defense, and disaster relief, to profit-driven corporations. In this new system, conflict and catastrophe are not problems to be solved, but markets to be sustained. The more chaos there is, the more contracts flow. Klein shows how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan became fully corporatized. Private contractors outnumbered U.S. soldiers, earning fortunes through security, logistics, and reconstruction deals. The line between war and business disappeared. The market was the battlefield. The same logic extended to natural disasters. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, while the residents of New Orleans were still stranded, real estate developers and education companies rushed in. Under the banner of rebuilding, public housing was demolished and replaced with luxury condominiums, and the city's public schools were replaced by privately run charter schools. Klein describes it as a silent coup d'etat under the cover of disaster. The storm had cleared not only buildings, but political resistance, leaving the city open to corporate redesign. Naomi Klein exposes how the shock and rebuild cycle became the central operating model of 21st century capitalism. Each disaster, whether war, terror, or hurricane, resets society, allowing corporations to take control of what was once public: water, education, security, and even the right to privacy. The result is a new form of authoritarianism, one without dictators, enforced not by tanks but by contracts and consultants. She warns that this model feeds on crisis to survive. A stable world is bad for business. Fear keeps the economy alive. The state of emergency becomes the state of normalcy. The war on terror never ends, reconstruction never finishes, and recovery never arrives, because someone is always profiting from the chaos. Klein also highlights the psychological dimension of this era. When fear becomes constant, people accept surveillance, inequality, and militarization as the price of safety. It's not just economies being controlled, it's consciousness itself. The citizen becomes a consumer of protection, willingly trading freedom for the illusion of security. Part 5 ends with a chilling realization. Disaster capitalism is self-replicating. It destroys to rebuild, rebuilds to profit, and profits to destroy again. From Baghdad to New Orleans, the pattern is identical: shock, chaos, privatization, profit. Klein concludes that the free market has reached its purest form, a market that feeds on ruin, where suffering is currency and recovery is a commodity. Her message is clear: the era of shock is not an accident of history, it is the system's design. And unless people recognize that every new disaster is also an opportunity for exploitation, humanity will remain trapped in a cycle where each tragedy becomes someone else's business plan. Part 6. Iraq. The shock comes full circle. Part 6 of the Shock Doctrine represents the climax of Naomi Klein's argument, the moment when every experiment in shock and control merges into one global project: the invasion and occupation of Iraq. This is where the circle of the Shock Doctrine closes, as the methods once tested on individuals and smaller nations are applied to an entire country. Klein begins with the invasion of 2003, led by the United States, under the banner of liberation and democracy. The campaign was named Shock and Awe, a phrase that perfectly embodies the doctrine itself: a psychological and physical assault designed to paralyze the enemy through overwhelming force. But, Klein insists, this was not merely a military tactic. It was the ultimate expression of the free market experiment. The bombs did not just destroy buildings, they cleared the ground for a radical economic and political reconstruction. When Saddam Hussein's regime fell, the U.S. Administrator Paul Bremer arrived in Baghdad with sweeping powers. Within months, he issued dozens of decrees that transformed Iraq into a laboratory for neoliberalism. All state-owned industries were privatized, foreign companies were granted full ownership rights, and profits could leave the country tax-free. Tariffs were abolished and labor laws dismantled. Klein calls this the most complete privatization ever attempted, a corporate utopia built on the ruins of a nation. Yet, to implement these policies, Iraq first had to be shocked into submission. Bremer's order to disband the Iraqi army and purge all Ba'ath Party members instantly created hundreds of thousands of jobless, angry men, many of whom later joined the insurgency. Violence spread, but that chaos was not an obstacle. It became the system's fuel. Each explosion justified more contracts for private security, construction, and logistics companies like Halliburton, Bechtel, and Blackwater. Klein exposes this vicious cycle. The worse the situation grew, the more profitable it became. Inside the heavily fortified Green Zone in Baghdad, U.S. officials and contractors lived in luxury, with cafes, swimming pools, and air conditioning, while outside, the city lay in darkness and ruin. The divide between the protected and the unprotected became a living symbol of the new global order. One world of safety and profit and another of perpetual shock. Klein writes that Iraq was not simply a war zone, it was the first fully corporatized state, where private firms handled everything from oil production to prison management. In this context, Klein argues that the Iraq War was not a failure of capitalism. It was its logical conclusion. The goal was never peace or democracy, but the creation of a self-replicating market of destruction and reconstruction. Every bomb dropped opened another business opportunity. Every policy of chaos created a need for private order. It was, she writes, the perfect closed circuit of shock and profit. Klein also connects the war's brutality to earlier experiments in psychological and economic control. Just as Dr. Ewan Cameron's patients were broken down to be rebuilt, Iraq was stripped of identity, sovereignty, and infrastructure to make room for a new order, one dictated by Western corporations and foreign advisors. The parallels are chilling. From the human mind to the body of a nation, the method was the same. Erase, then reprogram. By the war's fourth year, the promise of freedom had dissolved. The economy was in ruins, sectarian violence raged, and corruption was rampant. Yet, for the global disaster capitalism complex, Iraq was a triumph. A model for future interventions. War had become business, and occupation had become privatization. Part 6 ends on a stark realization. Iraq was not an exception, but the culmination of decades of the Shock Doctrine. From Chile to Russia, from hurricane zones to war zones, the same logic had prevailed. Crisis as opportunity, destruction as creation. Klein concludes that the dream of rebuilding through ruin is a lie. There is no rebirth in obliteration, only endless suffering repackaged as progress. Her warning is clear and urgent. Unless humanity learns to recognize and resist this cycle of orchestrated shock, every new war, every new disaster will be treated not as tragedy, but as profit. Part 7: The Moving Green Zone. Walls, Buffers, and a Divided World. Part 7 of the Shock Doctrine brings Naomi Klein's argument to its haunting conclusion, a vision of a world permanently divided between those who profit from chaos and those who suffer within it. She calls this new reality the moving green zone, a metaphor for the expanding bubbles of privilege, safety, and control that shield the powerful while leaving the majority exposed to danger, poverty, and instability. Klein begins with Baghdad's Green Zone, a heavily fortified enclave built during the U.S. occupation of Iraq. Inside, diplomats, military officials, and corporate contractors lived in comfort, with air conditioning, restaurants, and coffee shops, while outside, the city lay in ruins. This physical separation between security and insecurity, wealth and deprivation, becomes for Klein the blueprint of the modern world. The Green Zone, she argues, is not just a place. It is a model that has spread globally, replicated in every crisis zone and wealthy enclave on Earth. From Iraq to New Orleans, from Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami to Israel and Palestine, Klein identifies the same pattern. When disaster strikes, a small elite withdraws behind walls, both literal and economic, while the rest of society is left to fend for itself. After the tsunami, for instance, poor fishermen in Sri Lanka were banned from rebuilding near the beaches for their safety. In reality, those coastal areas were quickly sold to international hotel chains. The same occurred in Thailand, where luxury resorts replaced fishing villages. Klein calls this the second tsunami, not of water, but of privatization and displacement. The world, she argues, is now governed by disaster apartheid, a global system of segregation where survival depends on wealth. The rich no longer seek to eliminate instability, they learn to live profitably within it. Private security firms, gated communities, exclusive hospitals, and elite schools have become the infrastructure of a new global aristocracy. The more unstable the world becomes, the more valuable protection becomes. And so fear itself becomes a commodity. In Israel, Klein finds perhaps the clearest embodiment of this logic. The wall separating Israel from Palestine is presented as a security measure, but it also fuels an enormous industry of surveillance technology, drones, and border systems. Israel, she notes, exports not only weapons, but expertise in living amid insecurity. Other nations buy both the hardware and the ideology, that division, fear, and containment are the only ways to survive in a volatile world. Klein's analysis widens to show that this mentality now defines globalization itself. The neoliberal promise of a connected, borderless planet has mutated into a world of gated integration, where capital, data, and elites move freely, but ordinary people are trapped behind borders, barriers, and poverty. What once was called the free market is now sustained by walls, checkpoints, and security zones. She also emphasizes the psychological cost. After decades of crisis and fear, humanity has grown numb to shock. We have learned to see war, disaster, and inequality as normal, inevitable conditions. The green zone mentality, she argues, has colonized our minds. We retreat into our own bubbles, disconnecting from the suffering of others. But Klein insists that this numbness is not natural. It is the final victory of the Shock Doctrine. And yet, amid this darkness, Klein finds hope. Across the globe, she sees communities from Lebanese neighborhoods to Sri Lankan villagers and New Orleans residents refusing to rebuild their lives according to corporate blueprints. Instead, they organize locally, share resources, and rebuild on their own terms. These acts of resistance, though small, represent the first steps toward what she calls shock resistance, the rediscovery of collective memory and solidarity. Part 7 closes with an image that is both chilling and defiant. The green zones of privilege continue to expand, floating from one city to another, guarded by walls and fear. But beyond those walls, in the world's red zones, millions are awakening to how they have been manipulated through crisis. Klein ends with a call to remember and reconnect. We have lived through decades of shocks. Now it is time to learn how to resist them. Her message is clear. The walls that divide us are not permanent. They depend on our fear and our forgetfulness. Once people reclaim their memory and courage, the green zone will crumble, and in its place, a shared world built on justice and empathy can finally emerge.